Once upon a time, Jesus was teaching his friends, his followers, his disciples, basically trying to get them prepared for what was to happen in his life. And he was sharing with them about the coming suffering that was going to take place. And so he's explaining to them how he was going to be arrested, he was going to be mocked, he was going to be scourged, like whipped and beaten. And in response to that, you might anticipate a lot of different things that the disciples of Jesus might say. They may say something like, Jesus, we're so sorry that you're about to have to undergo all of that suffering. They could have said something like, Jesus, is there anything that we can do to help you? But in response, right on the heels of that, they make this statement. There's two of Jesus' friends, his followers, come up to him, James and John, and they make this statement to Jesus after he's talked about his suffering and all that he's going to undergo. And they say this, Jesus, we would like for you to do for us whatever we want. Interesting turn of events. And so Jesus responds and said, well, what is it that you want? And they say to Jesus, we would like, when we enter into your glory, for one of us to sit on your left and the other to sit on your right. It's a fascinating little exchange to me because what it illustrates is that at its core, Jesus calls us to something called self-denial. He calls us to this kind of countercultural way of looking at the world. And instead, oftentimes, of entering in with Jesus on that path of self-denial, the thing that culture and the world, and really I think the thing that our flesh calls us to is not self-denial, but self-promotion. To not be made less of, but to be made more of. This past week, I was reading a number of articles on the topic of self-promotion. Forbes has a number of these. One title is this, Positive Self-Promotion, 7 Tips for Effectively Increasing Your Visibility. So the goal here is to be seen and to be noticed, to be acknowledged. There are actually books on this topic. Harvard Business Review has one referred to as savvy self-promotion. And if you kind of question or doubt the legitimacy of this, I think for guys at least, I think there's something hardwired within men, and you can kind of do a litmus test on this at some point. It is impossible for a man to do the dishes without one of two conditions. One, it's impossible for a man to do the dishes without making lots of noise, like doing the dishes loudly to broadcast so that everybody is aware I'm doing the dishes. Or if it were to happen, now this is like kind of a unicorn type thing, but if it were to happen that the guy does the dishes in the home without announcing it loudly and everybody being aware of it, it's impossible for the man to leave that gesture of service unknown by others in the home. So what happens is, did you notice that the dishes are done? Maybe I'm the only one that has that propensity, but I think there is within all of us this desire to be recognized, to be known. And what we're going to talk about today is a holy habit, a way of abiding with Jesus that helps us break the power of that desire to self-promote. It helps us overcome that tendency that we all have, not just to serve, which it's good that we serve, but to serve with this self-interest, to serve in such a way that other people see that we're serving. And so the question I'd like for us to ask today as we get ready to study this passage is not, am I serving? Hopefully you are serving. It may not be in the context of the church. Hopefully you are serving within the body of the church, but hopefully you're serving in your homes, in your communities, in your school systems. But the key question is not, am I serving? The question I want to ask today is this, do I have the heart of a servant? And that's really what I think this passage calls us to ask. If you'll open with me to Philippians chapter 2, we're going to begin in verse 3. Paul, as he writes to the church in Philippi, offers what I believe is one of the most convicting passages that clarifies for us the heart of Christ as it relates to serving. And so as we're called consistently from culture to self-promote, Jesus calls us to self-denial. And in these words we read here, there is a description given to us of Jesus, and we're called away from self-promotion into self-denial. Verse 3, as Paul writes, he says, do nothing, this is a broad umbrella term, do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit. Now, there'll be multiple pause points in this passage where you just can ponder and pray and really let God's Spirit do His work as we read His Word together. But this first phrase, when it says, do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, ought to put us in a position of saying, ouch. Because most of the things that we do are not done from this motive. Most of the things we do are from a posture of selfishness. What can I get in return for what I'm doing? So he's calling us again away from self-promotion towards self-denial. He says, but with humility of mind. In other words, intentionally placing ourselves in a position of serving others, putting ourselves under others. With humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourselves. I think I can say, I've got 4 kids at the house, and I know it is just, we are not born with this in us, to consider others as more important than ourselves. As adults, we find clever ways to mask and disguise our selfish bent, but it is hardwired within each of us to consider ourselves as more important than others. Paul, he goes on, he does not lower the bar. In verse 4, he says, do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others. Have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus. And here, friends, is where we see the portrait of the heart of a servant. Verse 6, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped. Now, if you're familiar with this thing we know of as the incarnation, Jesus coming as God in the flesh. We'll see in just a moment that he emptied himself does not mean that he became less God, less divine. Rather, he clothed his divinity in flesh. In verse 7, but emptied himself, taking the form of, and here's the key term, the form of a bond servant. Now, your translation might say slave. Well, that's an accurate interpretation. This word here literally has to do with somebody who places himself or herself under someone else. And so the position that Jesus takes in verse 7 is that of a servant. And again, the primary question that we need to ask from this passage as we see how this passage speaks to us is this question, is do I have this same heart? So the position here is that of a bond servant. The practice that is given to us in verse 8 is this. Being found in appearance as a man, here's how Jesus practiced his servanthood. He humbled himself. That is, he placed himself in a lower position. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. And so here's the model that's given to us. With our flesh that cries out self-promotion, notice me, recognize me, pay attention to me, the model that is given to us is of Jesus who served people who spit on him. And I'll be honest with you, it doesn't take somebody spitting on me to discourage me or demotivate me from serving them. It can take a lot less than that. But what Jesus did in the portrait we're given here is he was willing to humble himself, become obedient to the point of death on a cross. He died for people who whipped him, who beat him, who spat upon him. And the central truth I want us to take from this is that Christ-centered serving is a way to bring honor to Jesus and deepen our friendship with him. We are, and hopefully we know this, that we are called to be servants not to be sitters. There's this powerful passage in Ephesians 2, verses 8 and 9, where Paul clarifies that it is grace that saves us. And he makes this statement that it's not through works, so that none of us can boast. But right on the heels of that statement about God's grace, he calls us God's workmanship, and he communicates to us that God has created us for those works that we might walk in them. And so the point that we draw from this is that we are saved to be people who serve, not to be people who just sit around. And as we think about this as a holy habit that we want to incorporate into the rhythm of our life, serving is something that allows us to become more like Jesus. And I think we're never more like Jesus than when we're serving out of a place of humility, out of a place of not desiring recognition, not desiring applause, but simply serving because we look at the interests of others and we want to be a servant. But serving is something also that helps us not just become more like Jesus in our character, it actually allows us and enables us to be with Jesus while we serve. And this is a big challenge, and I think this is the potential that service has to be a holy habit that helps us to abide with Christ. This past week, we went down on Monday. Our family flew down to New Orleans to see Aaron's family. And so we get to the airport. We begin the travel from we went to New Orleans to a beach in Alabama. And everybody talks about Southern charm and Southern courtesy. I'll tell you this. Once you get on the interstate, like the interstate is the great equalizer and eliminator of any kind of charm or generosity or anything like that. And so as we're going from New Orleans and we make our way heading to the beach and we're on Interstate 10, this is like an area God really is working with me on. And so we try to be real with people. And so in the interest of being real with people, one of the things I cannot stand is if you try to drive an appropriate safe distance behind whoever is in front of you, like 2-3 seconds or whatever, everybody else interprets that as, hey, drive in front of me and cut me off. And so when this happens, it just frustrates me. So here I am trying to, drive behind, and this started happening again. It's like, here we go. And one person after another cuts me off. And when that happens, I've tried this multiple times and it doesn't work. It's like I want to catch them in time. Like I see them coming behind me so I can step on the gas. Has anybody ever done that? Right. So step on the gas. The problem is we have a Honda Odyssey. And then a 4-cylinder Subaru. And so every time I try to do this, it's like I push on the gas, it makes noise, and the engine does not accelerate. Meanwhile, the self-centered, arrogant, disrespectful, inconsiderate, driver over here is just like they have the momentum and they're zooming by me. And like 9 times out of 10, they cut me off. And I can't tell you, it's like embarrassing how much of my joy I have forfeited to people who have done this. And so as we're driving along, I had this thought. I really believe this is a thought like the Lord speaking to me. Perhaps not, but I think it was. And one reason I think it was the Lord is because it was not for me. And the thought was, be a guy who lets them in. And another reason I think it was not me is because I immediately started thinking that's a stupid idea. Like I could give you all kinds of reasons why not to do that. That's not right. That's not fair. And I think the key objection I have is they don't deserve it. Right? And so I filter. I'm fine with serving. Some of you are too. I'm fine with serving if I think they deserve it. If I think they've somehow merited service, or if I feel like they'll be grateful in response to my service, I'll serve. But this passage here, personally, where I find it convicting is I think it calls us to serve even though we won't get paid back, even though we won't get thanked. And so I had this thought, be the guy that lets them in. And my response is, well, they don't deserve it. And here's kind of the thought that came to me is, Jesus let me in when I didn't deserve it. And I share this generally by way of like, I really want God to grow me in this area. The truth is, I'm fine with letting people in. I'm fine with serving, if I feel like they deserve it. Where I have a challenge, serving, letting people in, putting myself under them, considering their needs above my own. Where I have a challenge with that is if I think they're inconsiderate, or I think they're rude, or I think I have this capacity, and if you don't know me, please come back to Grace Chapel. This is a wonderful church. But I have this, I generally have this capacity. Like if I see that car that cut me off 20 minutes later, I want to do the same to them. That's my flesh. But here's what we have an opportunity to do. When we see serving, and specifically trying to adopt the heart of a servant as a holy habit, it gives us the opportunity. When somebody is going to cut me off and I see it, I'm going to make a conscious choice in that moment to either A, move into anger and vengeance, or move into a space of Jesus, thank you for letting me in when I didn't deserve it. One invites the grace and mercy of God into my life. The other forfeits His grace and mercy in my life. And so you can hold me to this over the course of time as we journey together. I want this to be true. And for you in your life, you may just be the most patient, gracious driver in the world. If you are, bless your heart. And your challenge may not be something that's on the road. It may be the way that your spouse treats you. Maybe the way that your boss relates to you. That everything in you, you know what the Bible says, take on the heart of a servant, but everything in your flesh says they don't deserve it. And if the filter we use, frankly, if the filter we use to determine whether or not we serve is whether or not a person deserves it, we will not become more like Jesus in this area. And so I would just encourage you and challenge you to consider, view service as a holy habit, that when you do it, when you voluntarily, intentionally put yourself under someone else to meet their needs, what you're doing is you're inviting Jesus to abide with you. You're becoming aware of His presence. You're being reminded of what He has done for you. And so what I'd like to do is just to look at and kind of examine our hearts, 5 marks of a Christ-centered servant. And as I read these, we'll go through these fairly quickly. What I'd ask you to do is just to kind of pray to the Lord as I share these and ask yourself, are these true of me? Now, there are a lot of ouch moments, I think, in these statements. And so if you want to say ouch, please do, because it is convicting and it is challenging. So the first mark of a Christ-centered servant is this. Number 1, I serve for Jesus and His glory, not the applause or approval of men. I think this is the core litmus test of our motive. Why? Why do we serve? Do we genuinely serve to make much of Jesus, to help people see how good He is, or do we serve so that people can see us? And Paul, as he wrote to the church in Colossae, he said, in the 3rd chapter, he said, whatever you do, do your work heartily for the Lord, not for men. He goes on to give his explanation. He says, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance. It is the Lord Christ whom you serve. From whom do you want payment for your service? Is the payment you want for your service the applause, the recognition of other people seeing what you've done? And some of you have experienced this already, but what happens when we make people the rewarder and we seek their attention, we will inevitably become disillusioned, become disappointed, become frustrated. If our faithfulness to serve Jesus is tethered to the faithfulness of people to praise us for our service, we will eventually become unfaithful because people will not faithfully tell us all the good that we do. And so it's possible for us to serve, but do it for our own glory and our own attention. And so I think a mark of a Christ-centered servant, somebody who's serving from a place of humility, is that we serve for Jesus and His glory, not the applause of men. A second mark of Christ-centered service is this: I'm just as content to serve in private, and this is tied in directly with the first, in private with no recognition, as I am to serve in public with recognition. Can somebody say ouch for me? This is a tall order here. I think if you really understand God's salvation and His grace and how He works, we can all say that we don't serve to be saved. I mean, service is something that kind of flows from our salvation. So we don't serve to be saved. But here is the other statement that I think is a lot harder to make with integrity, is to say this, that I don't serve to be seen. So we understand service doesn't save us, but if we view service as a means to people looking at us and increasing their opinion of us, we're not serving with the same heart that Christ had. This is the problem that many of Jesus' opposition had to Him. In John chapter 12, we read, "Nevertheless, many even of the rulers believed in Him," believed in Jesus, "but because of the Pharisees, they were not confessing Him, for fear that they would be put out of the synagogue." Notice this, verse 43. "For they loved the approval of men rather than the approval of God." And so, how content are you to serve without recognition, without people noticing? As a pastor I heard years ago, went to a conference in Dallas. His name's Todd Wagner, and he told the story of when he was in college. He worked at a big youth camp, and part of his job was to go, and after everybody had cleared out of the auditorium, he took a broom, he swept, and he mopped, and he cleaned that auditorium up. And the way it was set up is it was kind of an open-air auditorium that had curtains on the side, so you could roll the curtains up and the breeze could come through, or you could lower the curtain, raise the curtains up, lower the curtains down. And he said one night he's in there and he's cleaning and he's working and he's doing all this stuff. He notices that he's by himself. He can't see anyone else, but more importantly, nobody can see him. I shared the story before. What he ends up going and doing is he pushes the button to raise up the curtains so that people can see him serving. Just ask, you and the Lord, consider this. Do you ever have that temptation when you're serving, when you're doing something, to raise the proverbial curtain so that somebody can notice, so that somebody can see how hard you're working? I picture Jesus sometimes when He went to wash His disciples' feet. Like if Jesus had been a politician, or if Jesus had been a preacher, most likely, what that scene would have looked like is that about a day or two in advance, Jesus would have gotten His followers together and said, "Hey guys, here's what I'm going to do in a couple days, but we need to make sure that the press knows that I'm going to be doing this, and we need to make sure that somebody is there to take pictures of this, post it on social media. Now, when you take the picture, I'm going to act like I don't know that you're there. It's going to be very sincere." I mean, that's the world we live in. I mean, it's just so normal for us to be drawn into self-promotion. But the model that Jesus gives us, He was content to serve without recognition. The third mark of a Christ-centered servant is this: when I serve, I put the needs and interests of others above my own. That's the direct call of Philippians 2. Not just considering what you want or need, but considering what others want and need. To that we may say, well, if I don't look out for my own needs, nobody else will. I believe the vision of Jesus and the vision of the New Testament writers is that we would look out for one another such that, if you picture we got a church of 300 adults or so, whatever it is, imagine this with me. If instead of everyone having to look out for himself or herself, if you had 200-300 other people looking out for your back, guess what? You wouldn't have to look out for your own. You would actually have people who are ready to meet your needs. And I think that's the vision that we're given to us through the life of Jesus and through the account of the New Testament. We do consider the needs and interests of others above our own. The fourth mark of a Christ-centered servant is this, that I serve when it's hard, not just when I find it personally fulfilling. Work here, not to move on to a soapbox, but I think much has been made of, you find your thing, and you find your calling, and you find your gift, and you find your little sweet spot, and you stay in that. But I would just remind us that a servant in Jesus' day didn't get to choose their task. They didn't get to choose their terms. They simply chose the position of being a servant. And over and against the idea, and I understand we want to find our spiritual gifts, and I think it's very good and healthy and wonderful things associated with that. The problem comes when we filter everything through the lens of, will this fulfill me? Friends, that is not the heart of a servant. That is the heart of a self-seeking, self-centered individual that is using service as a way to gratify the flesh. One is very honoring to Jesus, the other is very dishonoring to Jesus. We can serve and do the right things outwardly, but if our heart is doing it for glory from people, God is not impressed with that. And so over and against the idea, well, it has to be fulfilling to me. It has to be something that jazzes me up. Verse 8 of Philippians 2. Jesus humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death. How fulfilling do you think it would have been for Jesus to die? And so the fifth mark of a Christ-centered servant is this, that serving is a reflection of who I am, not just what I do. A friend of mine told me years ago, he said, Brian, if you want to know if you have the heart of a servant, pay attention to how you respond when someone treats you like one. I didn't like that statement then, and I don't really like that statement now, because it surfaces, it exposes that in our hearts, we'll be servants as long as people view us positively, but if they actually treat us as a servant, but the core here, again, going back to verse 7, that Jesus took on this form of a bond servant. It was his position. It was his nature. It wasn't just something that he did in terms of his activity. It's who he actually was in his identity. And again, the question today is not just this, are you serving? If you're serving, that's great. If you're not, goodness, let's begin serving. Let's serve in the local church. Let's serve in your homes. Begin there. Serve in your workplaces, the school systems, wherever God would send you. Be serving. But really the challenge today is do it with the heart of a servant. Serve out of this place of humility. And so just to ask a few questions to probe, do you tend to complain when you don't get served the way that you wanted? Do you tend to think, now we're way too wise and modest to state this outwardly, but do you tend to think that you're owed certain services because of your status? It's a big question, I think. Do you get upset if you don't get recognized for your efforts? Does your motivation depend on how much people are aware of what you're doing? It happens often within ministry, I think life in general, that if a person's motivation is tied to approval from people, eventually their motivation will give up because they realize we don't get the applause that we desire. And the heart of a Christ-centered servant is somebody whose motive is different. So a couple of practical suggestions to put this into practice in your life. If you think about actually going and serving, 2 practical suggestions. The first is this: always encourage, explore now, discover later. If you say, well, I don't know how I would serve or where I would serve, again, we talk about consistently ways to serve within the local body. But the best thing I would encourage for you is just to begin exploring and let God enable you to discover what you're wired for, where you excel at, and then join God in that area. One example I've had recently is Terry Cartwright. He's not here this weekend, so I can make fun and give Terry a hard time, but Terry has been, for the last couple of years, filling in a lot when I've been gone. And the backstory of this that you may not know is that for probably 6 months or a year, I was twisting Terry's arm. Saying, Terry, I think you need to do this. Brian, I don't want to do this. I'm old. I mean, in his words. And so it's this ongoing conversation. Terry, do that, back and forth. Finally, what happens is, if you're familiar with it, Terry begins to explore. He says, all right, I'll preach, I'll do this. And it has brought such joy to me, and I believe blessed the heart of our church to see him stepping forward and begin preaching. Well, it wouldn't have happened had he not begun to explore now and discover later. The truth is, you may explore and do things that you realize, oh my goodness, if I have to do this forever, I'm just going to quit church. I'm going to what? And so you may find those things, but in the process, most likely you're going to find things that do bring you life. And so explore now, discover later. The other is, and this is one of the greatest killers to having the heart of a servant, and I would encourage you, don't compare your gift to others. One of the ways we quickly digress into self-centered service is when we look at our service through the lens of how does it compare to somebody else's. The way that I'm serving is I'm taking care of children, or I'm greeting, or I'm seeking to be a good role model in my home. The way that I'm serving is showing my children what it looks like to love my wife. And the way that I'm serving, it's not public. A lot of days when the day is done, nobody's coming up to me and saying, oh my goodness, thank you that you washed the dishes. And for me, I know this. Again, it's a challenge. I want God to grow me in this area. Be the guy that lets them in. May not be the case that other people notice. Well, my kids probably would notice a transformation in me. My wife certainly would. But the goal is not other people seeing. The goal is you're inviting Jesus to be the audience. You're inviting Jesus to be your friend. You're inviting Jesus to share that experience with you. You're seeking to see service as a means to abide with Jesus. And friends, when we approach it with that heart, there's power there. There's life there that man can't give and man can't take away. But there's a permanence to the work of God in our life when we transform how we view the serving that we bring to the Lord. And so I would just encourage you, whatever your wiring is, you may feel as if it's kind of a main and plain type gift that's not flashy. There's no ooh-ah attention given to you. Use it for the glory of Jesus, and when you use it, invite Jesus into that process of using it. When you're in your home and nobody else sees you doing the things you're going to be doing, Jesus is with you. Use that as an opportunity to invite Jesus in to abide with you. When you're trying to invest in the person who rejects your efforts, listen, nobody else may thank you for that or see that, but Jesus is with you. Abide with Jesus, Him in you, you in Him. Let that be a way to deepen your friendship with Him. I'll close with this one just encouraging thought. For those of you who, frankly, you're just frustrated and tired, you become weary in serving, become weary in what you've done. I close with these words from Paul. Galatians chapter 6, verse 9. Let us not lose heart in doing good, for in due time we will reap if we do not grow weary.